I mean, I talk from personal experience as well. Somebody who's been the target of hate crime, and actually recently there's been a successful prosecution in that regard. I think legislation is important.
The more I hear of Humza Yousaf's hate speech legislation, the more it starts sounding like a personal crusade against people who are not very nice to him on Twitter. You probably saw the recent case where someone was convicted for behaving in a threatening and abusive manner towards Humza Yousaf by tweeting something to him. This was after the Islamic terrorist attack in Paris. Someone replied to Humza on Twitter, "Humza Yousaf, good Scots name. I'm sure he's 90% backing Muslim killers. Be having a whip round for terrorist families soon." And the person was convicted of a crime on the basis of that. I mean, is that threatening? It's obviously not threatening. Is it abusive? I wouldn't describe that as abusive. I'd have thought if there's any crime being committed here, it could be for making claims that are untrue. Maybe Humza Yousaf could have sued him for libel. But threatening and abusive? So it seems already the court's understanding of abusive is pretty loose. But anyway, let's move on to the hate speech legislation. I mean, this terrible hate crime bill and the hate speech element in it is just appalling, but it's progressing its way through the Scottish Parliament. Terrible danger to freedom of expression. And I made quite a long video about it 6 months ago when the bill first came out. You can watch that. I'll put a link to it at the end. But Humza Yousaf is now in retreat and is modifying the bill here and there in minor ways, I would say. And we're going to look at some of the recent discussion and some of the ways that it's been changed. Now, what I'm going to show here is from a committee meeting in the Scottish Parliament, where the committee chairman is a Conservative. You see, generally the Conservatives are just sort of meekly nibbling around the edges of the bill. They're not really going for the jugular to get the whole thing kicked out. They're just trying to, squeeze it here and there. And we hear Humza Yousaf replying.
Say that I thought it was exceptionally important that we listen to all views, and of course we give weight to all views, but I did think it's important to give additional weight to those who are often the victims of a particular hate crime. And when it comes to the racial stirring up offence, I do think there's a justification for treating the racial stirring up offence differently to the other offences. Now that does go counter to, you're absolutely right, from a legal purist point of view, it goes against legal purity. I accept that. It potentially causes a hierarchy, some would suggest, and I don't think that's an unfair suggestion. But I do think there's a justifiable case for treating race differently. We know that 2/3 of all hate crime in Scotland relate to race. We know that there's no denying of the prevalence of racial crime.
So there we have Humza Yousaf quite happy with the idea of there being a hierarchy of groups. So crime on the basis of race is the most serious. Less serious than that is, say an attack on someone because they're gay or disabled. And obviously even less serious than that is an attack on someone who's able-bodied, straight, white person. So what is this difference is talking about to do with race? Well, the difference is that in the law that's been proposed, it will be illegal to be threatening or abusive towards people with the various, on the grounds of the protected characteristics. But for race, it would say threatening, abusive, or insulting. And the reason for that is because the existing law already has insulting in it. So they just want to leave it in. But it would make race different from the others by including this element of insulting.
I think what I've always said in relation to the question of insulting is at the very least, amongst those who are targeted the most by racial hatred crime, then there's a perception that there would be a weakening or a dilution. And that's not true.
Is that really true? Would anyone suddenly start feeling vulnerable because sort of one word had disappeared from the law that they might not have even known existed in any case? Anyway.
So yes, that perception is there in the communities that you're referring to, but it is an inaccurate perception, isn't it?
But I'm sure you would also agree with me that public confidence in the law is hugely important. That perception alone could be damaging. So I don't disagree with, the legal purity of your argument, that it may not have a material impact in terms of prosecution.
So the point is that there might be a perception that people are less protected, but in actual fact, it wouldn't make any difference to who is prosecuted. In other words, Humza Yousaf is agreeing that the word abusive already includes or covers insulting, and the legal bodies seem to be backing him up in that view. So there's no behaviour that would be covered by insulting that wouldn't already be covered by abusive. And if you look at dictionary definitions, that does seem to be borne out as well. But let's continue.
We will therefore propose amendments to the provision so it covers the absence of religious belief, and also to include references to clarify that mere expressions of antipathy, dislike, ridicule and insult are not on their own criminal behaviour.
So what we've got here are some freedom of speech protections. There are already some in the bill. Humza's talking about some extra ones added around the area of religion and non-religious beliefs. So they're clarifications. That obviously is the wrong approach. If you start trying to specify what people are allowed to say, well, that's really the wrong way about it, isn't it? You should be specifying just very clearly what people are not allowed to say. Well, in fact, I'm not sure you should be doing anything at all. But anyway, but the important thing here is this freedom of speech protection includes that it is okay to be insulting. But 10 minutes earlier, Humza Yousaf was saying that insult is covered by abusive. But now he's saying abusive does not cover insulting. I mean, this is a blatant contradiction. Yet it passed completely unchallenged in the Holyrood Committee. Anyway, let's move on to the definition of abuse now.
So what is your position on the notion that the word abusive needs to be defined to ensure that it is objectively understood in the context of this bill?
Well, again, from a Scottish perspective, again, as convener, you know only too well that there has been an offence for the last 10 years of threatening or abusive behaviour. It has been prosecuted again without much challenge in terms of the definition of threatening or abusive behaviour. Certainly none that's come to my attention.
Now, if you look at a dictionary definition of abuse, Cambridge English Dictionary, it says using rude and offensive words. Using rude and offensive words. That's a pretty low threshold, isn't it? I would dispute that definition. I would think abuse also needs to include an element of like harshness or aggression, needs to be targeted at an individual. So I think it definitely does need defining beyond ordinary understanding or beyond dictionary definitions. Now the response here that Humza makes is that there's already a law that criminalises threatening and abusive behaviour, and that law seems to work perfectly well. But that law does define what threatening and abusive behaviour is. Let me read the law to you. It's a threatening or abusive behaviour. A person A commits an offence if A behaves in a threatening or abusive manner, okay, and the behaviour would be likely to cause a reasonable person to suffer fear or alarm. Okay, so with that law, the precise definition of abusive, well, we could debate that, but in the law, it's only abusive if it's likely to cause a reasonable person to suffer fear or alarm. So it's defined within that law, but it's not defined within the new law. But they seem to claim that the old law somehow clarifies it, but it doesn't. Anyway, so without clear definition, we're left with the existing law that says behaviour that would be likely to cause a reasonable person to suffer fear or alarm. That's part of the definition of abusive. To the dictionary definition, using rude or offensive words, I mean, that's a pretty broad spectrum, isn't it? So it looks like we really need to be defining what abusive means. Let's see what they can come up with.
For example, Tim Hopkins, on the 17th of November in oral evidence to us, from the Equality Network suggested, in quite strong terms actually, that he thought that abusive must be interpreted in an objective way. And he suggested a way of doing it would be to amend the bill by ensuring that it says that behaviour or material is abusive if a reasonable person would, in all the circumstances of the case, consider it to be abusive. What harm would be done by an amendment to such as that? And if no harm would be done by an amendment such as that, why not do it?
So a couple of things. One, and I should have said this at the very beginning, that we'll continue to, of course, reflect on the evidence that was given, but also any recommendations for amendments that come forward. But it is the law of unintended consequences, because if you have a definition, therefore anything that falls outside of that definition would not be included. And therefore we have to ensure that if we are going to include a definition of abusive, it has to absolutely capture all of the behaviour we want it to capture. that can be challenging. And again, in relation to the word abusive, whereas I see no reason why the ordinary meaning of the word, the dictionary definition, can't be used and isn't well understood.
I mean, first of all, that's a bad argument to say it doesn't do any harm, so why not put it in? You've got to explain why it does good, not why it just doesn't do harm. But anyway, Humza Yousaf says he doesn't want to define abusive because he doesn't want to limit its scope. He's worried that if it's clearly defined, you'll know what you can and can't say, and he doesn't want that. He wants it to be open-ended and vague and flexible. I mean, that's more or less a definition of an unjust law, because for a law to be just, the citizens need to be able to understand it and know how to keep it. Whereas if these terms are undefined and vague, then it doesn't meet that criterion. Now, the proposed definition here, something's abusive if a reasonable person would think it abusive. I mean, that's not exactly helpful, is it? Does that really make it into an objective definition? I mean, it's circular for a start. I mean, what difference does that definition make? Is anyone going to say, I think it was abusive, but a reasonable person wouldn't think it was abusive? I mean, that's just irrational. I mean, this contributes nothing in terms of clarity to the law. And yet they're throwing around this idea in the committee in the Scottish Parliament. Now, I think the existing law about threatening and abusive does sort of help to define abusive, behaviour that would be likely to cause a reasonable person to suffer fear or alarm. But they reject that and instead want to keep the law vague and nebulous. Right, next we move on to the section of the law relating to plays and theatres. And Humza Yousaf has submitted to the pressure on this and is dropping that section of the law. And in the speech to this committee, he made it quite clear that that was happening, that that part of the law had been abandoned. And just a few minutes later, an MSP, who had for all that time had been in the same committee, came and asked this. Just listen to our legislators in action.
A brief exchange earlier in relation to some of the concerns that have been raised with us around the implications of this bill for plays and other public performances in theatres. We've certainly been told by relevant witnesses that they don't believe there's any need for a separate provision in this bill in that regard. I was just wondering whether you'd agree that Section 4 could safely be omitted on the basis of what the committee's been told.
So I'm not sure if Lee McCarthy was able to hear my opening remarks or not, but yes, I indicated in my opening remarks that we will be bringing forward amendments at stage 2 to remove part 4 of the bill, having reflected on the evidence. Section 4. Yes, not part 4. Thank you. Part 2, Section 4 of the bill. We definitely don't want to get rid of part 4 of the bill. That's staying for sure.
We heard quite a lot of evidence about this chilling effect, if you like, that could operate. So, having heard the committee's evidence, do you think that the bill as drafted could have that chilling effect on writers, on journalists, on artists, such that the bill might, as we heard, cast a long shadow, particularly over people's fear of that investigation?
Well, I would certainly hope not. I accept the point that, again, going back to the question of perception, that there could be a perception that the bill does restrict people's freedom of expression or journalistic expression. And therefore, that's why we made the changes that we did to move the new offences to intent only and remove the likely limb, because I was persuaded by the fact that at the very least there was a perception that might infringe upon people's freedom of expression, and therefore we wouldn't want people, particularly journalists and writers, etc., to be self-censoring. That wasn't what the bill was to be about. So.
Well, of course it's about self-censoring. I mean, that's a big part of what laws are for, aren't they? To deter that type of behaviour. I mean, now they've changed the law, so they do have to prove intent to stir up hatred or whatever. I mean, that's good. That has made the law slightly better. But how are they going to prove it? I mean, they're not going to put electrodes on your skull or something and detect it in some sort of objective way. So if they've decided that the material or the statement, whatever, was hateful, I mean, it's a very short step to saying that already proves that you were intending to stir up hatred. So I'm not particularly reassured by that change.
I mean, just picking up on this line of questioning, one of the characteristics that some witnesses have suggested should be considered for inclusion in the bill is the characteristic of homelessness. And it's not clear to me if offences against those who are sleeping rough on the street are offences which are motivated by prejudice or motivated by vulnerability.
I mean, this is the way debate goes with hate crime, hate speech legislation. There are always more characteristics that you could add in to it. There's always someone who feels they've been left out. So different characteristics or vulnerabilities as well. And the debate just descends into a total muddle, which is great for virtue signalling debate at Holyrood. Any idiot can join in. I mean, even I can do it. I mean, let's say, what about a mother who's attacked with a baby in a pushchair? Is that a hate crime against a woman, or is that a crime against a vulnerable person? Which one should it be? Whereas I would say, I don't care. Just lock them up for 10 years, either way. Now, the next clip is going to show a common phenomenon in the Scottish Parliament. That's an MSP asking a question in a committee. Now, these committees are supposed to be for analysing and scrutinising bills. But the MSPs often ask the most anodyne and simplistic questions that don't move debate forward in the slightest. Like this.
So I'd like to ask the Cabinet Secretary if you would agree that the purpose of this bill, despite a large amount of often misinformed hype surrounding it, is to give reassurance to victims that hate crime of any kind is not acceptable in Scotland and they will always be protected by the law.
Yes, I mean, I think ultimately, of course, that's correct.
So just a couple of points to wind up now. Just watch this.
Lucy Hunter Blackburn referred to stickers that had been displayed at the University of Edinburgh, which said woman, noun, adult, human, female. Lucy Hunter Blackburn told us that the Scottish Trans Alliance suggested that people might want to refer those stickers to the police, and the university did so as potential hate incidents.
So the Scottish Trans Alliance advised people to report these stickers to the police. And that's the culture that exists very strongly. If something's not quite liberal or progressive enough for someone's taste, they assume that it's probably a crime. You can report it as hate speech, as a hate crime. Now, in terms of causing fear or alarm, that does cause a lot of people fear or alarm, because they say something perfectly reasonable and someone says, that's a hate crime, I'm going to report you to the police. That causes fear and alarm, but obviously they're not bothered about that at all. These people deserve to be scared out of their wits for just expressing their opinions. And it goes to the police. Do you trust the police to be unbiased in how they deal with it? Sensible? No, not at all. When it goes to the courts, that case I talked about earlier, do they seem reliable in interpreting these things in a reasonable manner? No. But this is even before Humza Yousaf is planning to make the law far more reaching. Right, the next thing is just a little bit about the definition of transgender to do with transphobic hate crime and hate speech. Just listen to this.
In prepping for this, I came across an interesting FOI, which has just actually come out on correspondence between Equality Network and the government on what the definition was. And this says, a man who is not a trans woman but wears a dress for a drag performance or a trip to the Rocky Horror Picture Show, or because he feels an emotional need to cross-dress occasionally. The other part about this is that at the other extreme, so at one end it's a dress sense, at the other extreme it can be a paraphilia. It is listed as such in the DSM. It sometimes is accompanied by a crossover with other indicators for offences, and so you get this quite bizarre situation where something that may be done for purposes of arousal is being protected under a hate crime law.
Now, I'm not going to comment in detail on that issue, but it does show how radical taxpayer-funded campaigners are calling the shots. But it is interesting, though, autogynephilia, or cross-dressing for sexual arousal, is effectively now regarded as a protected characteristic. Now, For Women Scotland, the group that the woman there is representing, they're feminists, basically. And that's how they get there. That's how they're regarded as semi-respectable. But they just pick up the one issue of gender recognition, basically. And they don't even, I would say, address the whole of that issue, just some narrow sections of it. So they're very much at one track. Whatever issue they're talking about, that's the element they're going to pick up on. But on that issue, they're very good. They're excellent in making that point. I think on the broader range of issues, like they support hate crime legislation, for example, I think they're wrong. But just to conclude here, Humza Yousaf is in retreat over the hate crime, hate speech legislation, but is only making fairly insignificant tweaks to it. And the bill is not being properly challenged in the Scottish Parliament. Now, the next video I'm going to make is a related issue, which is about the proposed misogyny law, where Scotland is set to lead the world again in the wrong direction. Thanks for watching.